Before we start, I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl at KYNDRYL, Kyndryl.com. Imagine speaking to the person who presented to the leadership team about the threat of the iPhone and what it felt like and how the leadership reacted. Because we have that person, I found the document. It appeared on the web about 3 years ago, the iPhone document that a team of strategists and market intelligence researchers inside Nokia presented to the leadership team. And we're joined today by a strategy professor from Adelphi University, just outside New York, Timo Partenen. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, I'm happy to be here.
It's great to have you with us, and thanks for agreeing to do this. I know you're friends, and you've listened to the rest of the show with Timo and Kui. Maybe let's share the context of what you're doing now and what you were doing back then before we start to explore the document.
Well, as you say, currently I'm a professor in Adelphi University, just outside New York City. But before that, and the reason why I'm here is that I worked for Nokia in their strategy, in their market intelligence organization in different roles, approximately 2001, 2009. So during a period when iPhone was launched.
Let's share a little bit about how it felt for you as well. I mean, Nokia was doing so well. What was bubbling? What was happening? What was changing at the time when the iPhone came out? Because also you were starting to see the decline of companies like BlackBerry, but it didn't appear all of a sudden. So I'd love to really get inside the atmosphere inside the organization, because so many people who are in that position in the company don't realize it when it's upon them. And I'd love you to share the kind of conversations that was happening, the kind of temperature inside the organization, and just what people were talking about.
As in your previous shows, it has become obvious many people had a very different perception there. So iPhone didn't come out of blue. We had the signs that Apple is preparing iPhone. So they had acquired, was it the company that developed the multitask interfaces, was that FingerWorks or something like that. They had been recruiting wireless engineers for several years. So putting all these together, it was pretty easy to see that, yeah, they are coming to our domain. And we got the pieces of information from there and there and there. So, and we had been communicating to top management of Nokia or Nokia's different product divisions about the threat of Apple for several years. So as such, the announcement of the iPhone, the slide set that we are probably going to talk today more, wasn't the big news as such. It was very much expected. Something like this is coming out one day. At the same time, there were other trends, as you mentioned. For example, the usability of Nokia phones that had been one of our competitive advantages, say earlier, 5 years before, that had been eroding quite badly. That was a constant message that we were getting from customers, from market research, and so on. And it was well recognized. It was well observed that the touchscreen devices, not only phones, but also other kind of the devices like MP3 players and so on, are coming to market, and they are user-friendly and people love them. We had, for example, in the last couple of earlier years, flagged up that screen as our first competitive issue in the coming years. We had that sort of list that what keeps us awake during the night. And that screen had been like 2005, 2006, the top issue for that. So when the iPhone was launched, the device itself didn't surprise us. What surprised us was the ecosystem that Apple was able to build around. Especially Cingular, the American operator currently known as AT&T. They were collaborating with Apple very closely with that. And I think that's the point with Nokia's issue with American operators in your previous podcasts. We had not been able to get into American operators with our smartphones. And then they suddenly go all in with Apple. That was a surprise. That was a bit of the surprise there, as well as how I think Google and Yahoo were on board with that initiatives. So they really came up as a big coalition rather than a single product launch. So that ecosystem perspective was something that took us a surprise.
I love that you're sharing this, and it's so interesting. I was reading recently, and we've an episode coming soon in the show. It's about Steve Jobs' next year's. It's a book by Jeffrey Kane, and it talks about how he failed in a way to build an ecosystem around app developers. And what you kind of see is it was almost like the lessons he learned that he paid forward and brought to Apple when he came back the second time. And you can see it there with stuff like the ecosystem.
It's actually interesting to notice there that initially iPhone was closed ecosystem. The Apple Store was not open for the outside developers at the beginning. But very soon they realized they need that developer ecosystem there. And then, as he mentioned, his previous experience and connections played well there.
I'm sure somebody reminded him. I mean, the whole idea of history is written by the victors is very annoying for somebody who was there. And I wondered about that. Some of the myths you hear and have heard over the years, I'm sure it hurts sometimes when people talked about Nokia as a failure and, oh, they didn't see it coming. Many, many people make that mistake. And that's why it's so great to talk to somebody who was there, because I have a huge amount of empathy for you and your colleagues at the time, because of things like the Cingular surprise that you tried to do these things before and the carriers were pushing back all the time. So it wasn't as if you didn't think about it. You thought about so many things.
Nokia's working mentality at that time was very much about the hardware specifications and so on, and also in the intelligence functions. Primarily our job was to try to scout that what kind of the features our competitor devices will have, what kind of the competencies they are building, and so on. So while we saw those things, and while we didn't we were not surprised about the hardware of iPhone, and probably we can talk about that in a second bit more, we didn't necessarily understand that well all the, shall I say, business side of the aspects that they were developing, their partnerships, their collaboration agreements, and so on. And that was a blind spot for us in the intelligence.
And when you tried to do those things, was there a resistance? Because you mentioned about how it took Nokia a long time to break into America in a way. And I read that we covered a book called Losing the Signal about BlackBerry a few weeks ago. And it talked about how BlackBerry basically fooled Nokia with BlackBerry Connect for a long period of time. And there was a lot of resources wasted with that partnership. And it kind of, in a way, marked Nokia where you had this bad experience and it was difficult to break America.
I'm not an expert of all the discussions that were going on at that time with the operators. And indeed, that might have been one of the challenges for Nokia, that we were a very European-focused company and we didn't have a big enough presence in America. Actually, Nokia was trying to relocate some top management and so on to America exactly for that purpose. But generally, my understanding is that at that point of time, when internet was still a relatively young thing and mobile internet was non-existent, so everyone was trying to think how to strategically position that they can control the mobile internet. And the American telcos were relatively bigger in the technology industry at those days than they are now. So they wanted to be in control, and Nokia, being the world leader in cell phones, was seen as a threat. That if they let Nokia in, Nokia is going to take over. Nokia is going to provide different kind of the mobile internet services. While then working with the relatively smaller companies in that domain, like BlackBerry, or probably what they assumed of the Apple, was seen as their way of bringing in these smaller partners that they can use to fight Nokia. I haven't done research that. I don't have kind of the evidence. I haven't been talking to the boards of the American telcos in those days, but that's my assumption how it went.
Before we get into the document, the famous document, and I don't want to be bringing up old pains in any way, I wondered about the Symbian investment. So had it started at this stage? So this is the operating system for those people who don't know what Symbian is. Had it started before Apple, or was it triggered by Apple? And that whole period of time, because from the 3-part series we did with Hui and Timo Partenen, what you see is that people didn't want to talk about it not being very good, and they knew it wasn't very good. And you and market intelligence must have known, compared to competitors, it wasn't where it needed to be. And I just wondered what the atmosphere was about that inside Nokia.
Good question. So first about the intelligence function, that we are usually looking outside. We are looking the external information. I've been wondering afterwards, should we have had kind of the internal intelligence, someone who would have been the kind of the truth teller about our own competencies? So yes, we were telling that the competitors are coming with a certain kind of the innovations, they are recruiting certain kind of the competencies and so on. We had some sort of the vision that what they might be doing. We didn't actively benchmark that against our own development. So while we are presenting that, say, that screen is important, and it seems that we are not currently in very good position with that, if somebody from the organization who is responsible about, say, that screen UI development comes and says that we will fix this, we have plans for it, we didn't challenge that.
That's really interesting. That's the thing that comes across most from the research on emotions, is that it wasn't safe to be that person. It wasn't safe to be the truth teller, and you suffered from the shoot the messenger bias. Is there anything you'd like to share about that? Because it sounds to me like you are that type of character, especially if you're doing strategic work, that you knew these things, but if you shared them, it was almost like a black mark on your resume.
Now let's think about my previous role where I was heading a long-term market forecasting. So I go a little bit back from the iPhone era. Now, there were product categories that Nokia was trying to pursue in the market, and our long-term forecasting team didn't see really future for that sort of the specific products in the market. And we in the long-term market forecast, then forecasted, if not a declining or vanishing market, but at least significantly less growth than those business units wanted. And that created quite a bit of conflicts with the heads of those business units whose business we were ruining with our too pessimistic forecasts. So yeah, there was that kind of the, use a black mark in my CV in those days, but that was for the quantitative market forecasting, which then leads to the planning that how much we will be able to sell and so on. So when I moved to head the market intelligence function, which is more qualitative in that sense, it became easier to ignore. So if you are telling messages that don't resonate with the managers, yeah, they listen us because we are institutionalized bearer of that messages, but they don't act on those. So there was some parts of the organization which perhaps ignored, but I think the top management mostly listened to what we said and mostly took things quite seriously.
It seemed to me, again, and it's very, it's great to talk to, because there's parts of the documentation where there are people who share their experiences with Timo and Kui, but you still don't know what that was like. So say, for example, you're presenting to the board, to the senior leadership team about these oncoming threats. They think they've made the message clear to the product managers to actually do something about it, but the product managers aren't doing something about it. It seemed to be get stuck in the translation of the order to we need to do this as priority, and people were frozen by fear of, oh, well, we're not going to do that because we control the resources, or was it we think that's the wrong thing to do? Where did it get stuck in the middle?
That I do not know, but reflecting what you just said and what you have been talking earlier with Timo, is that our communication was very much targeted to the business unit boards or corporate boards. We were mostly communicating up. When we were communicating kind of sideways to the, say, product planners or product feature road mapping teams and so on, wasn't maybe that kind of the strategic message that We need to do big changes. That was very kind of the operational checking, are the megapixels in our cameras aligned with what we expect competitor roadmaps to be. While we perhaps created that external fear to the upper management, we didn't do that to the middle management.
So there was no urgency because they didn't feel it.
I think that what's come true also from the other research that you have been talking. I haven't researched that myself, so I do not know what exactly they felt. But that's my impression. At least we didn't push that information actively enough to that direction.
That's why it's so useful to share these messages to help other people, because it's often in your position, you wouldn't think that was necessary. But what we see more and more when you study this work is you see how important it is to listen down and message down and make sure all those messages are aligned, because you can think you're very, very clear at the top of the organization, but the rest of the organization haven't a clue what we're doing. They're just showing up and doing their work every day because that's what they're measured on. And I'm not looking here for blame. I'm trying to avoid blame in any way, and actually trying to go, how can we take lessons from this? Because that's what I find so interesting about Nokia is that I like when I was a professional rugby player for 10 years, and at the end of my career, I started to follow Nokia. I was like, this is an amazing company. And it was November 2007, and the stock was like up here, and I was like, this is an amazing company. And then it just dwindled. I was like, oh, what happened? So I have huge empathy and respect for what happened in Nokia. So I don't want to. I'm not like that with my work. I don't want to go, oh, idiots. It's the opposite.
I think the main learnings from that intelligence era for me is that in that sort of the function, you need to try to find a fine balance that you are not just a yes man telling the news that top management wants to hear, but on the other hand, you cannot go all in challenging that everything you do is wrong, because then you are ignored. So you need to find a way to communicate there. Then another thing is that you need to have institutional support for your messages. And I think that came very well what you discussed in the earlier episodes about the period around 2012, where Nokia changed the management mode so that it was more data driven. And what I referred to my market forecasting period, which was quantitative, became the market forecast for the future. And we were part of the institutionalized process of planning our financials, our production, and so on. But the market intelligence function, where we try to wave the flag that, hey, Apple is coming, Apple is going to hit us badly. If it is just a PowerPoint presentation presented in the management team meetings, that is not doing the work. It has to somehow get into the operational process where people are making those often quite low-level decisions. That is a link we didn't build well enough in those days. Then in this strategic aspect, I'm not sure how companies could prepare themselves for that sort of the massive disruption that this caused. I think that they need a lot of flag wavers coming with the news. They need challengers. They need to hear that from the customers, suppliers, and so on. But changing kind of the fundamental idea of the top-level management that, hey, what we are, what we should do, what we should focus on, takes definitely much more than just the intelligence function.
That's fantastic. It speaks to, we did a long-form series with Joe Bauer, who was the thesis advisor for Clayton Christensen, and you're probably familiar with his work of resource allocation process. And for me, what you're saying there speaks to the resource allocation process, because he gives a great example about Intel, that when they moved from DRAM to semiconductors, they did it 18 months after the organization did it at the lower levels, because they saw the value of moving there. And then they announced it as a strategy, and people down the levels are kind of like, we did that ages ago. So it can actually lag the other way. And to your point, if you don't get inside the heads of those middle managers, you don't change the future of the company. And I think that's why I wanted to bring you on, and through your lens now as a lecturer and a strategy professor, is it's easier in a way to see it in retrospect, than it is in the moment. Because there's a great saying, it's hard to read the label when you're inside the jar.
Oh yeah.
When it's you and you're stuck and you're doing the work and you're rewarded on the present, it's very, very difficult to see yourself in the moment.
Yeah, and then comes another angle. Because if you will now look the document, finally, what we've been talking, you will notice that it goes to quite detailed hardware specifications and so on. And actually, this is a shortened version. There was a much longer version distributed as well. But point is that there are a lot of data points. And when somebody in the middle management reads it, they probably read it through their lens. And Nokia being a hardware-focused company, a lot of the middle management read that document that, okay, iPhone's hardware is not that great, that we are doing well here. They pick the message they want to hear from that.
I love that. That's so key. So let's share it now. So let's share it, and you take us through it. I'll navigate. I'll drive it for us, and I'd love you just to comment on it. So, where was this? Where were you in the meeting? Like, who were you talking to? If you can, whatever you can share. I know there's going to be some confidential stuff, but this was.
Yeah, I think
it was a two.
Yeah, so first of all, recalling something exactly what happened almost 20 years ago might be a bit challenging here. So as you see already from this, Nokia was organized quite much in silos. So all these abbreviations after our names indicate the different corporate units we were working on. And this was a document that was put together from the Nokia's Light Intelligence Organization. And that is actually one thing that perhaps was a challenge, that the different managers in different parts of the organizations got slightly different messages. All right. So this was a document prepared right after iPhone was launched. This is a document that, if I remember, was distributed quite widely also beyond the Nokia's board. So this is perhaps a bit sanitized version of all the analyses we have done. This doesn't include references, for example, to our future products. It doesn't include speculative information that we couldn't be confirming that we were communicating perhaps in other sessions.
Okay, so I'll flick on to the next page, and so here we go. Executive summary. So again, were you a presenter of this knowledge to the team? There was so much detail here that you had right. That's what I find so fascinating. It's not like you didn't know. It's like you knew very, very well. You had brilliant market intelligence.
Yeah, so we had, as I said, we had been following Apple for several years at that point of time. So there was not that many big surprises. This was conclusion that, okay, what information was confirmed, what information was new. And we had quite a bit of time to think about the implications as well. And I don't think any of the proposals we made here would be universal. So when I presented this, I don't think anyone in the management disagreed with the proposals that we are making. They may prioritize them differently. They may think that something is maybe not that urgent and so on. But overall, I think everyone was nodding here at this point of time in the top management. And if I recall, some discussions were around how we could use the other US operators. Point 4, how could we collaborate with them? Is our coming portfolio strong enough to work with them? Can we get them on board with the products?
So you were asking all the right questions. Like I'm asking our audience here, business people, to put themselves in your shoes and go, you had the information, you thought you were taking action on that information. And the question you always go is, did you have the capabilities to carry the strategy through anyway? Or had Apple, because they were a computer company and the game had moved from a mobile phone to actually a smartphone, had they just got such a head start that it was so difficult to catch up anyway if you wanted to?
Yeah. Yeah. So Nokia was often a quick second in its actions. So at that point of time, Nokia was still leader in smartphones. The market was small, and our Symbian phones, now retrospectively, were not that competitive. But overall, the feeling was that yes, this is again some trend where we might be a little bit late. We are not going to touch screens to the same volume as early as Apple, but if they become successful, we will flood the market with a different kind of the touchscreen phones to different price points, different consumer segments, different product categories. That's what we did with the earlier products that we had missed. If you remember, for example, before iPhone, there was a big hype around a Motorola Razr, the very thin phone. And Nokia had identified also the miniaturization trend, but we had misinterpreted it so that people want smaller phones, while the thin phone became the absolute winner. And yes, then when we noticed we missed that trend, we created a portfolio of thin phones across the different price point. We had a very cheap thin phone, we had a very fashionable thin phone, we had a business-focused thin phone, and so on. Pretty much killed the Razr with that. And when we were talking about this, I don't remember, was it in management boards or some more informal meetings or some other occasions, atmosphere was very much, okay, we might be late with this kind of the product, but we have something in our pipeline that will have that screen, that will come with the music. That will be a great experience. We are able to use our scale, our distribution. Apple will not be growing as fast as predicted. About this slide that you are now showing, probably the third bullet point there was something that had most comments among the higher level of management, that getting really the Cingular CEO, Google CEO, Gary Young from Yahoo on the stage. That ecosystem that Steve Jobs was building around, that was something that we didn't understand. What are they planning all together?
And the last question there, Timo, on the page as well, is this a direct challenge to M's multimedia computer positioning? What's that in reference to?
M was our multimedia product division that was responsible for the different kind of the higher end smartphones. And we were at that point of time positioning, I think maybe in the next slide we will talk about, what was it, that N700 and 800, which was kind of the multimedia computer product, which we saw in principle targeting a very similar market, but it was not doing well. It was not that good product, to be honest, and operators didn't support it that much. But I think that reference in the slide kind of the referred that is this kind of the product positioning going to work, or is Apple going to take over this part of the market?
There's a couple of things that just came to mind where when I studied this over the years, the Nokia story, and it's got much richer, obviously, with conversations like this. And I think that's one of the pities about this, is that people make a decision based on a tiny piece of information. Like you said, even within Nokia, everybody saw it based on where they were inside the organization. There's a law called Miles's law, which is where you stand depends on where you sit in the organization. So marketing sees it different than R&D, sees it different than finance, etc. And a couple of things came to mind where some of the stories you hear are, well, Nokia had developed a touchscreen phone way before Apple did. That's one. The other was Nokia also developed an iPad way before Apple ever had an iPad. And then the other is that you also had an app store before Apple ever even had an app store. And that they were ideas that came from within Nokia, but were rejected, or leadership said, no, we're making progress with this. This is where we're going to focus. And if you can share or comment on that, I wonder what your thoughts were.
let's start with that App Store part, for example. That was something that, from my perspective, was identified that, hey, we have here the App Store, which is not working great, and Symbian was really bad from the developer point of view. And idea of having the external applications in our phone, building that sort of the platform strategy was there. Execution, yet again, the resource allocation, Nokia being hardware company, probably all the software initiatives didn't get as much emphasis as they should have had. I remember telling prior iPhone that when some sort of the benchmark results, some sort of the market research results about the usability of our app store, both from the user perspective and from the developer perspective. And these issues were flagged. And when some senior vice president or vice president, I don't remember, says that we will take action on this, from my perspective, I can take the intelligence studies done. And I don't know if anyone ever then followed up that issue. Nokia's innovation. Nokia came up with actually quite a lot of innovations in those years. So, for example, one of the response strategies for iPhone was that Nokia launched the music phone, or actually a range of the music phones, because we thought that the music is going to be the killer application in iPhone. They had the iPod before. So we launched Express Music series, and then I think half a year later than iPhone was launched, we launched the service Comes with Music, which provided basically that when you buy a Nokia phone, you get free music for a year. At that point of time, it was not streaming in music. It was downloadable MP3s, but you can download all the MP3s from Nokia Music Store. So kind of you can think about that as Spotify's version 20 years ago. And you get that subscription free for a year with Nokia's. Several things why it didn't succeed. Inertia of incompetency. Our biggest customers, operators, didn't want us to go that way. We didn't have enough resources, execute that strategy correctly. We didn't have enough probably capabilities to do it correctly, and so on. So plenty of thinking, but I think a lot of the issues then come back that Nokia didn't think beyond these devices. For example, for that, Nokia didn't think that this could be potentially a Spotify type of service that would be independent from the other services. We saw it as a tool to sell our phones, because that's where we got our money.
And it's very hard not to. I mean, even it's very useful now on having the language. It's one of the reasons I love doing this work and speaking to people like yourself, is you put a language on how to think about these things. And you see that many times when an executive team struggle with the future, they don't have a way to think about it. So they'll have a lens to see what's actually happening here. Some of the things you were saying there, we had Paul Nunes on the show before. He was the head of research for Accenture, brilliant guy. And he talked about the hidden S-curve. So there's the S-curve of the product, there's the S-curve of the industry, but there's also the capability S-curve. And the capability S-curve starts to fail as well when it's a jump to a new curve, where you jump from hardware to software or ecosystem thinking, which, how could you have that when you have been a hardware company? And then one of the ones I just wanted to ask you about there, you touched on it briefly, was what's called premium customer captivity. So your customers actually dictate where your resources go in the future. And your customers didn't want the music thing, so you didn't do the music thing because they were the ones with the power. And I wondered just what your thoughts were, particularly on that one, that how much a customer can dictate where you go in the future.
They definitely dictate a lot, because you need to listen to your best customers, and especially in this kind of the industry where in many markets you had only a few key distributors, the operators. You don't want to take initiatives that would harm your position with them. So that is often a situation where outside disruptor can come to the market and create something that an incumbent firm couldn't do. Apple did it for us here, very obviously.
Yeah, because they don't have anything to lose. I think that's such an important thing, that you have so much to lose. The incumbency problem the endowment effect, it's called in biases, is that one of the things Paul Nunez told me about Nokia, and I'd love to qualify it, is that you had massive mortgages on investments in factories in China to develop the dumb phone, essentially a normal phone, versus no skills to develop the smartphone. And because you had made that investment, it was very difficult to pivot when you had that hanging over you.
That's why internally Nokia was split into divisions. So we had the mobile phone division, which was taking care of this low-end part, and we were trying to develop the cheapest possible phone in the world. And then we had other organizations that were both physically and mentally far away from the old business, which were trying to develop multimedia products, enterprise products, gaming products, music products, and so on. So we did recognize this, that the investments we have made to become the world leader in the low-end phones may harm our capability to be innovative at the same time. Because it goes very much back to the very basic exploration versus exploitation paradigm in the organizations, that if you want to be efficient or if you want to be innovative, often you need to separate these things.
Because one of the other things that from the outside, so I've spoken to Gary Hamill, Rita McGrath, lots of consultants who worked with you, and you had access to the best consultants in the world, the best thought leaders in the world. And again, there's a notion that there was arrogance inside Nokia, and it doesn't appear to me from talking to people who work there that it's not so much individual arrogance. It's this is working, we're making profits, the strategy's working. It's a strategic arrogance, and it's a different thing.
Yeah, probably very right with that. Nokia talked a lot to outsiders. We heard a lot of comments. We try to apply the best knowledge we can find everywhere, both support the product development, managing the organization, and so on. But yes, when you are one of the most valuable companies, one of the most respected brands, you are having great profits, your CEO is named the CEO of the year for several years, and so on. It's hard avoiding becoming somewhat arrogant because everything seems to be working pretty well.
And that's why we're doing this series, is just to see. It's hard to read the label when you're inside the jar. Maybe we're on page 4 of the iPhone now.
Okay, let's go back to it. Yeah.
You mentioned actually the touchscreen UI, and you mentioned that you could see the strategic M&A that was happening inside Apple, that they were buying companies to piece together capabilities that they build the future. And you were watching this closely.
Yeah, I think it was probably 2005. I think I just had started in my intelligence role when Apple announced the acquisition of FingerWorks, which was a multi-touch UI company that had developed, I believe, some products, some devices. Sorry, I don't recall now all the details, but yeah, it had been on the radar, and we had seen that happening. We had seen both phones and other devices getting touch screens. If I recall correctly, iPod had that a simple touch screen at that point of time, and so on. So yet again, we saw that coming. Yet again, we heard the messages that our touchscreen user interface is being developed, and in the products we launch next year, we are going to have a S60 touchscreen user interface. And well, you have heard the story why we didn't have it then.
It's interesting where you said you were also used to being a second mover, or being a fast second mover, and the second mouse gets the cheese sometimes. But here, the second move, you never caught up, just really because you didn't have the capabilities to do. So I can see why you thought, oh, it'll be fine because we've been here before and we've caught up, and actually we've killed that person, like with the razor you told us. So you can see why when you share these conversations, you can start to get inside your head. Here's a typical model you talk about here of hardware, is to start at the high end and then make cheaper and cheaper versions. And again, you call that out here because that is what happened initially with the iPhone.
Yeah, and here our expectations was then that Mobile Phones Division, which is our mainstream phone division that make those phones that cost €100, $100, that will get hit in the future. But at that point of time, we didn't see immediate threat for that one. We expected that Apple will launch a mini version of the iPhone later, and we had plans to turn that with a product that turned out to be then Nokia 5800. And here you see also the point that Nokia's mental model was very much about the hardware. So although in the first point we highlighted here the user interfaces, but then comes this kind of the discussion that, hey, this is not any super product from the hardware perspective. We can do better.
And you totally get it. I mean, it's like people talk about Kodak, and Kodak, the mental model was selling film. Your mental model was selling hardware.
Yeah.
And it's a totally different skill. It's a totally different mindset. It's like even we saw in the press industry where they went from analog to digital. It's a totally different mindset. And a lot of it's giving away your content. And people who sold content could not understand that. So you can see why the mental model shift is such an important aspect of all this. I'm happy to share this. We're on page 6. For anybody who wants to just get in touch with the show, and we'll share this document, and I'll put a link on our Substack. But here you predicted how the market share would play out. And I wondered how you felt it was versus actually what happened. And when it didn't go as you'd predicted, how did that feel? And how did they react inside Nokia?
Now I have to say that I don't recall by heart. Did they reach that 1% market share in 2008, or did they already get higher at that point?
I would think it was 1%, and they weren't a threat in the early days. And then all of a sudden you were like, oh, because they just took half the market all of a sudden.
The initial target was quite modest in that sense. So this perhaps gave us kind of the false impression that we have a time, and eventually we didn't have then enough time to catch up. But if we would have had a product in the mid-range by the end of 2008 that would have challenged iPhone, this would have been perfectly doable for us. So 1.5 years from the launch, we could come up in the old world. We could have come up with a competitive product that we distribute more widely, price at a lower price point, and we kill the competitor. So we saw that eating the top end of the market. So we mentioned here 30% share of the phones more than €300. So we saw that in that particular market segment, it is going to be a killer product. That it's scaled down to the lower price point. So price point is perhaps wrong here because it was sold through operators and it was often given for either free or for very low price to consumers who then committed for 2 years, 3 years contract with the operator. So while we had seen of that in America, that's how the American cell phone market works. We had seen that we perhaps bit underestimate that how well Apple is going to sell this model or going to sell iPhones to consumers who at that point of time were spending, say, $200, €200 for their phones, that they were suddenly willing to upgrade a phone that is in the ballpark of $500, $600.
And you can see why it's an entire ecosystem shift. It included magnificent marketing. It included I think this is one thing people miss. It included the cannibalization of the iPod, because the iPod became the phone and people like kind of rationalized it and went, oh, well, I'm actually just buying a new iPod that happens to be a phone here. And they rationalized it then. But also the business model was a big shift where, as you said, the mobile phone market worked where you got a device and it locked you in. And it works that way, but that hadn't come across Europe at that stage, that model. So that was another big shift.
Yeah. In Europe, that was a somewhat new thing. It was in America, it was in a few other markets, but the European market was Nokia's home turf. That was something we didn't expect to happen that quickly.
So I'm going to skip past a couple of slides because you go deep into the phone analysis, which is all so accurate. I mean, you were so tight on all this potential position in the handset market. You were really, really tight with that. And the exclusivity thing here, you call out that because that was a huge blow, really, because this was the big shift I felt. And also, even BlackBerry were struck by this because you'd both tried to do things like this before. Nokia and BlackBerry had tried to do things where you could sell essentially through the phone as an ecosystem. But that was controlled by the carriers. And think people missed that because that took everybody by surprise, the incumbents by surprise.
Yeah, it took, and I would love to hear comments from the Cingular management at that point of time. Did they think that will happen? Because operators were afraid of becoming a bit pipes, that they don't control anything, they are just transferring data. And that's what they have become nowadays. And this was the move that killed the operators' potential in the mobile internet application space. You didn't need any more Cingular applications, T-Mobile, Vodafone applications. You could go with Apple and Google.
It's so true because I remember buying ringtones on my Nokia. Remember the Imperial March, the Death March. I remember buying that, and you bought it from the carrier on the phone, and then of course it's a computer, a smartphone's a computer, so you don't need to do that anymore. And there's so many back doors to get content on your phone, etc. So, and you think about these moves that you wonder sometimes do people regret it, and where it's like in the newspapers allowing Google and Facebook to crawl their content versus actually coming together and going, no, you're not getting access to this. And really, it was a lack of understanding of what floodgates it would open in the future. We'll keep going on the document. So you talked about the marketing here. It was a cool product to have, and you were defined by the product, just like you were actually with like a BlackBerry as a business person before. You talked about the stock price getting a boost from it. So I thought we'd conclude with this, which is the summary of recommended Nokia actions. So what you recommended versus what happened. And even some of the recommendations, when you read them, you're kind of going, you were so right with these recommendations, but it just had, it was such a different context for Nokia. It was a different world that you were entered into here, that it was difficult even to compete, even if you followed all these actions comprehensively.
Yeah, very true. So there were some actions where we thought that we would have competencies very good. Definitely take these actions. And let's say point number 4, for example, that I mentioned, how we counter the iPhone mini, what we expected to come. Yes, we generally thought that we have competencies to respond to that. While then some other points that we mentioned here, which are more on this software development UI thing, like the number 2, we were aware of our lack of the competencies. We had communicated that message for a long time. I'm not in the position to say why we didn't see enough action happening on that. I think you have discussed that in the previous conversations. Points like 6 and 8 are developing new software solutions, developing partnership networks. They were borderline our capabilities. We were taking actions on this, but probably we didn't have enough resources. We didn't have enough world-class capability. When I now retrospectively look this list, would there have been anything else I would have recommended? Let me ask you, would you have recommended anything else to this list in those days or now retrospectively?
Great question. I've thought a lot about this, and it's why I wanted to have you on the show. It's why I wanted to do a deep dive on Nokia. I'm not finished, by the way. There's other books like Ringtone and Risto's book as well. There's lots of books on Nokia. I think there was so much you were doing that was right, and it's so hard to predict the way a market will go, particularly when the internet was such form factor change. Like it wasn't what you were producing on the outside. It was behind the phone. I just see that as so hard to understand when it wasn't your DNA, and that you needed really to listen to people and maybe back ideas. And when you knew there was an iPhone coming, maybe develop it at that time and go kind of develop products knowing that most of them are going to fail. I mean, that's the only thing, like you said, exploit, explore, but it's so much easier to say it in retrospect. And it's so much easier to say it when you weren't the leadership team, when you didn't have a stock price, when you didn't have market investors looking at you kind of going, why are you wasting our money on these toys? And you're kind of going, because those toys could be our future. So I see the difficulties.
Yeah, yeah. So looking down retrospectively, what should have been recommended is finding a bigger partner that comes with the muscles, whether it is Google or Microsoft, already at this point of the time, to really compensate our lack of the software development skills, our operating system status. So if you would have, say, been able to partner with Google to develop Android and be the first one to work on Android to replace our Symbian, well, the question at that time, a few years later, was that, okay, if we go to Android, are we going to be able to compete with Samsung? And our conclusion was no. Could we have made Android or Windows Mobile Nokia exclusive at that point of time? Probably not, because those software players were also thinking from the ecosystem perspective and wouldn't want to come to Nokia. But most of these actions, what we call here, are quite tactical in nature. So bigger strategic moves probably started to emerge only a few years later, when we started to see that we are not able to do this by ourselves.
Which is always the way, Timo. It's so you have to let it emerge a little bit, understand it a little bit more, and particularly when it's not your core competence. I think that's the difficulty here. There's a book we're covering. I'm just going to grab it from the shelf. So next up on the show is this book, Split the Pie. It's by Barry Nailbuff. And the reason I'm sharing it is he talks about a partnership like you and Google coming together, maybe to create a phone together. It's not about, it's difficult to see they're going to cannibalize us, but you think about what's the kind of third part that creates from you two coming together and you split that. That's why the idea of split the pie is the excess that's created by a partnership.
That comes probably partly from the Silicon Valley culture, where a lot of the companies are working close to each other, they are talking to each other, and they have learned the way of doing things. Then coming from the backwoods of North Europe, a company that is pretty much there alone, didn't develop that sort of the things, that the mental culture that we need to really collaborate with our competitors, or constantly be figuring out what could we do together and how could we shape this together.
Yeah, and it, again, easy to say in retrospect. And Barry's actually earlier book is called Co-Opetition, which is this idea of being a frenemy, that you compete, but you together create something new. Just like you said, where Google announced that they'd put their, and Yahoo, that they'd put their products onto the iPhone, and that was a shock to people in Nokia. And you get that because culturally that wasn't the way you did it, and you were very protective of your secrets, etc. The last thing I just wanted to ask was, one thing that really annoys you that people say on the outside that you just go, that isn't true. So there's always one of those that you just go, that just never happened. That people say it, a throwaway comment, or just in irritation, you kind of going, oh, we were doing that. Because you know, often an innovator, a head of innovation, will a consultant will come in and tell the board, oh, you should be doing this, and the board are all listening. They're going, oh, that's great. And then the head of innovations there, I've been telling these guys this for years.
Yeah, probably in those days, I was not so much irritated by outsiders coming to tell that Nokia didn't see this. Nokia should have done this. Nokia was arrogant, ignorant, whatever. I wasn't so much irritated about that. And irritation is probably wrong word, but frustration internally. Why things don't happen? Why I thought 4 years ago about the importance of a touch screen. I thought 3 years ago about the importance of the App Store. Why I don't seem to drive any action with these things. That was probably the frustration. But my frustration, talk about the feeling. So my feeling towards the end of my Nokia era was frustrated. And it was coming internally. Why I've been trying to push things, but I don't see anything happening. What is blocking? that am I communicating something wrong? Am I sending wrong message? Say, do I just don't have enough muscles being 30-something mid-level manager and so on?
One of the biggest frustrations of so many people who listen to this show, Timo, it hasn't gone away, man. It hasn't gone away.
Sir, and I see it in my current job as well. The academic industry is going through massive disruption in the coming years, and a lot of the universities are going to have the same experience than what Nokia or other failed companies have had.
And if they're lucky, they'll be able to resurrect and become a networks business like Nokia did.
They had to resurface in some other form of the higher education experience.
Exactly. And we look forward to that coming down the line. Speaking of which, if people want to reach out to you, where's the best place? Or will I just share your LinkedIn profile maybe in the show notes?
Say my LinkedIn profile. That's the easiest way of connecting.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Professor of Strategy at Adelphi University, just north of New York. If you want to get in touch with Timo, brilliant thinker, brilliant strategist, and brilliant guest on the Innovation Show. It's been an absolute pleasure. Timo Partenen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Aidan. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks again to our sponsor, Kyndryl, and the Kyndryl Institute, where you can find a plethora of brilliant thinkers from all over the world, including many of the guests we've had on the Innovation Show. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl at KYNDRYL Kyndryl.com.